The meeting was framed as progress, a conversation about alignment and the future. I remember noticing how carefully the language was chosen, how neutral it sounded, how every sentence seemed designed to reduce friction. There was no urgency, no raised voices, no sense of conflict, just the quiet implication that the decision had already been made somewhere beyond the room. Then the phrase arrived, almost politely: legacy thinking. It was presented as context, not criticism, as if naming it made everything self-evident. I nodded, thanked them for their time, and walked out carrying the strange weight of being dismissed for thinking too far behind, while still sitting at the center of a licensing engine generating $650 million a year. At first, the contradiction felt unreal. You're told your mindset no longer fits the organization, yet the systems you've built continue to fund the very momentum used to move past you. That tension followed me for days, not as anger, but as a question. I replayed the years leading up to that moment, not searching for blame but for understanding. Legacy thinking, as they called it, wasn't resistance to change. It was memory. It was knowing why certain rules existed in the first place, and which ones could be bent without consequences. It was recognizing patterns others hadn't lived long enough to see repeat. I wasn't protecting the past, I was protecting continuity, something far less visible and far more fragile than any innovation roadmap. What most people never saw was the architecture behind that revenue stream. On paper it looked clean, automated and resilient. Dashboards showed predictable growth. Contracts were neatly cataloged. Renewals appeared routine. But in practice, the system was alive. It depended on accumulated judgment, on exceptions negotiated quietly over years, on relationships maintained long after signatures were forgotten, on historical context that never made it into slide decks because it couldn't be simplified. Without losing meaning, I knew which partners required precision and which required discretion. I knew which clauses could delay payments for months if misinterpreted, and which risks were theoretical versus real. Control didn't come from ownership or title. It came from being the person people relied on when the standard process stopped working. That understanding didn't arrive suddenly. It was built slowly, through proximity to complexity others avoided. While teams rotated and strategies refreshed, I stayed close to the mechanics. I listened more than I spoke. I noticed inconsistencies early when they were still easy to correct. I paid attention to the small moments where systems quietly failed and were patched without acknowledgement. Over time, the structure adapted around that presence. Not formally, not visibly, but functionally. Things worked because someone remembered why they worked and how fragile they could become if handled without care. After the termination, the instinct to act immediately was strong, to remind people of what they were losing, to correct assumptions before they hardened into certainty. That impulse was emotional, and I recognized it as such. Acting from that place would have scattered leverage instead of concentrating it. So I paused. I resisted the need to be seen or heard. I gave myself space to observe without judgment. I mapped the system again, calmly, tracing dependencies the way I always had. It became clear that removing a person doesn't remove the function they've been sustaining. Momentum can mask dependency for a while, but only until reality introduces friction. Timing became everything. Intervening too early would look defensive. Explaining too much would dilute authority. Silence, used carefully, would allow the system to reveal its own limits. So I stayed available but deliberately restrained. When questions came, I answered clearly and precisely, without urgency or embellishment. I didn't volunteer solutions. I didn't issue warnings. I allowed gaps to remain where understanding was incomplete. Gradually, subtle friction surfaced. Approvals took longer. Edge cases accumulated without resolution. New decision-makers hesitated where confidence had once been automatic. Meetings multiplied, yet outcomes diminished. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarms, nothing that justified panic. Just enough uncertainty to slow momentum. The system hadn't collapsed, but it had lost its memory. And without memory, even the strongest structures become brittle. Emails began arriving with qualifiers instead of conclusions. Conversations expanded to include more stakeholders, but fewer decisions. The licensing stream wasn't failing, but it was exposed. Risk became visible in places no model had anticipated. What had been dismissed as legacy, thinking was quietly reinterpreted as structural understanding. There were no apologies, no public reversals, just a gradual recalibration. Influence returned not through confrontation, but through necessity, quietly, predictably, without spectacle. Looking back now, what feels most instructive isn't the dismissal itself, but how easily organizations confuse visibility with value. Modern structures reward what can be presented, summarized or labeled as progress, often overlooking the quiet disciplines that keep complex systems stable over time. Institutional memory is inconvenient because it resists simplification. It asks uncomfortable questions about why things work, not just how fast they can change. When that memory is labeled as outdated, it's usually because it doesn't fit neatly into narratives built for speed rather than resilience. I didn't lose relevance when I was removed from the room. The room lost context, and context once gone doesn't announce its absence immediately. It reveals itself slowly, through hesitation, rework, and invisible costs that compound long before they're acknowledged. Understanding that shifted how I think about power entirely. Influence isn't about being indispensable in name, but about being embedded in outcomes. It's about knowing when to speak, when to wait, and when to let systems reveal their own dependencies without interference. In that space, leverage becomes less about control and more about stewardship, less about authority and more about responsibility. The people who understand this don't chase relevance or demand recognition. They remain composed, observant, and patient, allowing reality to surface on its own terms. And when the noise fades and the narratives move on, relevance returns quietly, grounded not in perception but in undeniable function.